Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. So today I'm going to be talking to us again about something very, very important, and that is in histopathology. There is one of the common questions they ask, and that has to do with immunohistochemistry. Immunohistochemistry. So most time they are going to just call it IHC. I stand for immuno, H stand for histo, and C stand for chemistry. They're always going to ask you a question. What can affect poor IHC staining, and what do you do to correct it? What can affect poor IHC staining, and what do you do to correct it? Before we continue, my name is Dr. Emmanuel Obodo. I'm a biomedical scientist, and I'm also a lecturer in biomedical science here in the United Kingdom. So I've already told you, remember, in histopathology, obviously, one of the common things we know is that it has to do with the tissue, and most time we know about the common staining like H and E staining, hematoxylin and eosin. We know all of that. But there's aspect of histopathology that has to do with the antigen antibody, and that is immunohistochemistry. Obviously, when you talk about immuno, that's immune. That means you're talking about, antigen. You're talking about antibodies, okay? Now, when you talk about histo, obviously, you're talking about the tissue. Do you understand me, okay? Then, when you talk about chemistry, then you're looking at the chemical compound that you use for the staining. So, when you refer to immunohistochemistry, okay, then what you are looking at that aspect of the histopathology that uses antibody to be able to detect antigen, okay? So when you have a tissues, okay, so those tissue can be covered, or there can be presence of proteins, obviously, which are antigens as well. So what immunohistochemistry does is to use specific antibodies that can be able to bind to these specific antigens that you can find on the samples. Are you getting me? And that binding can now be able to amplify, is the identification if that antigen or protein is present. So that is immunohistochemistry. Immuno talk about the antigen antibody reaction, histo obviously the tissue, and of course chemistry then talk about the staining aspect of it. So the question now is, how would what could make this very IHC, that is immunohistochemistry, what could make the staining to be poor? What could affect it? What could lead to poor staining in immunohistochemistry, and what can you do about it? In other words, how are you going to correct it? There are a number of things that can lead to that, but what I'm going to do today is to list them, and hopefully in the subsequent videos I'm going to take the point one after the other. Okay, so number one, you need to know that because it's antigen antibody, one of the problem could be, one of the reasons why you can have poor IHC staining is when there is inadequate antigen retrieval. When there is inadequate antigen retrieval, that is the first one. Okay, another thing that could affect that is when there is poor fixation. Okay, about fixing tissue and all of that. If there is poor fixation, that could also affect it. And of course, another thing that can affect it, remember that is antibody that will detect the antigen. If there is inappropriate, antibody concentration, meaning maybe the concentration of the antibody is not appropriate, is not as required, meaning it may not be able to bind effectively. So number third one is inappropriate antibody concentration. Now, another thing, because of in terms of antigen antibody reaction, blocking, if you don't block no specific antigens or proteins, that could give you a wrong result, or it could lead to the antibody binding to anything that mimic that is primary antigen. But that's by the way, I'll talk more about that. But the next point, which is the fourth one, is inadequate blocking. And the fifth one has to do with poor primary antibody selection or quality. So when there is poor primary antibody selection, meaning you don't select the correct primary antibody. So when there is poor primary antibody selection, or the quality of that very primary antibody is not very good, that also can affect or can lead to poor IHC staining. Okay, Now, the sixth point there can be, inadequate secondary antibody. Remember that when you are doing this kind of IHC staining, you have primary antibody, you have secondary antibody. The same thing that happened with the primary antibody in terms of inappropriate primary antibody being selected or quality of it, not being appropriate, that could affect it. The same thing also happened to the secondary antibody. Hopefully, when I talk more about this, I can give you detail of how the principle of how this thing function. But anyway, inadequate secondary antibody can also affect it. And of course, if there is, the seventh one is poor chromogen development. So if the development of the color is very poor, and obviously because of maybe the point that we have highlighted before, or that could affect it. So poor chromogen development, so meaning the color did not develop as required. So poor chromogen development can also lead to poor IHC staining. Okay, then number 8 has to do with the incomplete washing, when the washing is not done effectively. And the number 9 has to do with the tissue section thickness. If the tissue sections are very thick, okay, thickness of the tissue section can also affect that. And obviously number 10 has to do with the poor tissue quality. So poor tissue quality, remember, the essence of effective fixative or fixing the cells or tissue rather, even the cells obviously, it has to do with the, to prevent autolysis or even necrosis as well. So if, the tissue quality is very poor because autolysis has occurred, okay, that means there's a degradation, or necrosis, meaning that the cells are dying, okay, that poor tissue quality can affect the staining. So poor tissue quality due to maybe autolysis not being prevented or necrosis, that could lead to that. Then number 11 has to do with the inadequate deparaffinization. Remember about paraffin wax, okay? So when you embed into the paraffin wax, okay, that keep the tissue intact. Then when you have finished cutting the section and do your flotation and all of that, it's important that you remove that very paraffin. So the process of removing the paraffin wax is what we call deparaffinization. So when you don't remove the paraffin very well, that could also lead to the poor IHC staining. So inadequate deparaffinization. Then the final one could be due to endogenous enzyme activity. So there could be activities of the enzyme in the endogenous or maybe intracellularly, and that in itself can also affect that. So these are the 12 points or reasons why you can get poor IHC staining. Hopefully in the subsequent videos, what I'm going to do is to take each of these points, okay, and go through them in details of how you can be able to correct them, and obviously what they mean and how you can be able to correct them. But hopefully with this point, it can keep you going till I make the subsequent videos. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. Please, can I ask you to like, share, subscribe? So I also would want to encourage you, if you need any help, if any form of support, maybe in preparation of your interviews or any question that you don't understand, feel free to contact Two Good Consultant, which you can feel free to message us on our WhatsApp number, or maybe send us an email, or as a case. By any means you can contact us. You can of course you can look at more detail on the YouTube channel, and do feel well to contact us. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best till I come back your way again. Bye bye.